Hello, everybody, and welcome to OAG's latest webinar, the last one of the year. And whether we'll be bringing you festive cheer or not, I'm not sure. But we're going to take a look back at what's been happening in 2023, and then I look forward to some of the issues that continue to plague the industry as it struggles to get back to full recovery. It's cold here today where I am, so there are hot cups of tea, although we're not all joining from this part of the world, so there are those who are in warmer climes. Welcome back, Edward. You joined us on a webinar, I think last in either late 2021 or early 2022, so lots to talk about since then.
Yeah, early 22 it was.
Early 22, yeah. Well, welcome back. Joining us, I think, from Kuala Lumpur today.
Correct.
So we'll look forward to hearing from you as we go. And of course, as ever, we have John Grant joining us from the balmy climes of the south of England. John,
yeah,
snowing today?
No, it's just London grey, isn't it? That sort of battleship grey. But we made it. It's December. Yes, another 10 webinars under our belts. So hopefully we're getting the routine right now.
Something. Well, yeah, I think we've been on this track since 2020, haven't we? So let's not think about how many years that and how many hours of webinars.
Slide number 3.
Yeah. Okay, so as we said at the start, we're going to take a look at performance in 2023. We're going to take a look at the data, so what is happening regionally and across some of the major country markets. We're still clinging on to 2019 as that benchmark of recovery, and maybe we should stop apologising for that. It's the only baseline, really, I think, that we've consistently had through the pandemic, and maybe it still has some validity in some places going forward. We're also going to have a look at what's on order in aircraft terms and some of the challenges around for airlines, both in terms of aircraft orders and the maintenance of their fleets. And then we'll dip in and out of what's to come for 2024. As ever, we'll be taking questions throughout, so please don't hesitate to drop them in the question box, and we'll get to them as they come in. So before we go into looking at the data, we thought we'd just share a little bit of a look back at those 10 webinars that John referenced. I think this is the 10th, I think, John. The eagle-eyed amongst you will note that there are 8 here on the screen. Couldn't fit 9, but that was the most recent one. So back in January, almost a year ago, we were talking about the fact that China had finally announced it was going to reopen, and it was a little bit of an unexpected announcement, although much longed for many key tourism markets, both in Asia and beyond. We had a sense then, I think, of huge pent-up demand, or maybe it was just a optimism of huge pent-up demand. And then in February, we started talking about connectivity, where what shifts were we seeing and what airlines were doing and how were networks coming back. March, we were really fed up with winter in the Northern Hemisphere by that point. So we had a nice beach view theme, and we started talking about the summer and what might summer 2023 bring. And I think there was hope, wasn't there, that this was going to be really a summer where we were back on track and things were moving forward. And then by April, we were back to looking at China again, wondering where the great surge of China outbound travellers might go. And at that point, I think the reality was beginning to be obvious that recovery in China certainly was more of a trickle than a surge. We then moved into talking about alliances and partnerships in May. Our alliance is still relevant. And it's worth saying, if anyone wants to go back and listen again to any of these, they're all available on OAG's website, and you can dip in and out of the topics as you see fit. Interestingly, in May, when I looked back at the content, we had started to hear and observe that delays in parts were really starting to impact on MRO schedules for airlines. And I think that is an area that we'll talk a little bit about today. And that's something that has certainly continued to hamper airlines' ability to fly fully the networks and schedules that they're planning. We then, as we moved into the summer months, we looked at business or leisure. There have been lots of media interest in were travel patterns shifting. Are people adding on holidays to the end of business trips? And we had some interesting discussion there. Then in July, we changed tack and we looked at sustainability and the journey to net zero, and took the temperature, I guess, if that's not too bad of a analogy, about the progress that the industry is making or not towards net zero. Then we took the summer, took a little bit of time off, and we came back and we looked back at the summer and how it had gone or was going. And we had an interesting conversation about Thailand and its expectation about, picking up where it had left off essentially in terms of China, and how Chinese recovery was not really delivering what was expected. And that theme has continued. I think we've seen the Thailand Tourist Board continually revising its predictions for the end of this year. And I'm sure we'll be continuing to talk about that into 2024. The slide that's not there, the image, was our last webinar in October where we talked about routes and revenues. And here we are now in December. And we'll talk about, I guess we'll touch probably on all of these things maybe as we go today. So let's move on and look at our first slide, which is the usual for those of you who listen regularly on global capacity. So what we've done this month is showing you the global capacity picture. And you can see the yellow line is 2023, the black line 2019. We're nearly there, John, aren't we?
You might think so. I don't think so, Deirdre. Sorry.
I was trying to be optimistic.
Okay. Right. Look, the numbers don't lie. No, we're not quite there. And I suspect we won't be there at the end of 2024 either, for the reasons we're going to discuss.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge now is that some parts of the world are beginning to display some of the characteristics of a slump or a downward trend in demand, particularly in the Americas, whereas in Southeast and Northeast Asia, we're still enjoying revenge spend and everything that goes with that. So it's mixed messages depending on where you are in the world. But I think the interesting characteristic as well is that we are seeing 3% less capacity, but actually about 8 or 9% fewer flights. So we're seeing larger aircraft being used in various parts of the world. And some of the impact of that is being most pronounced in markets such as North America, where regional jet flying is no longer economic, but more importantly is leading to some secondary and tier 3 airports in the US not being connected to hubs or only having a single connection. So it's I personally don't think we're going to get there. I mean, we're halfway. Well, we like to think we're halfway through the winter season. It's so grim in London that's not going to change before April, May. And because of all of those things that we listened to last week at the CAPA event in Abu Dhabi, you find it very hard to have much optimism about a 2024 breakthrough against 2019. And even if we do that, let's not forget that just takes us to where we were 4-5 years ago.
Well, I think
we've lost all of that capacity.
That's the interesting picture, isn't it? So we've added a chart here that just looks back to 2010. The industry domestically was growing about 4.5% on average each year. International growth was faster, 5.7%. And actually, we're not back on that trend yet, are we? And the question is, we always said it was going to be an extended recovery. We always said 24, 25, maybe 26 for some residual international recovery. And there's nothing sort of disputing that, is there, in terms of what we're seeing?
No, not in the data. And I don't think you can look away from the data. We'd all like to be optimistic. And for some people, it's their job to be optimistic when they're managing airlines. But you've got to look at the hard facts. And I think the other part to this is throughout 2023, we've seen aviation becoming more of a political tool for various governments. And we've seen some expanded air services. We've seen some reductions. And that's going to continue. It's become a bit more, it's the latest Nike football on the streets is aviation, and politicians are using it increasingly, both from a sustainability and environmental perspective, but also from that geopolitical type angle. And that's a bit of a worry for us all, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Let's hold that thought and move on to our next slide. So we thought we'd take a look at two sort of slightly different pictures, although the same style of chart here. On the left, we've got the top 20 domestic markets by volume in 2023, which geeky stat alert here, account for 88% of global domestic travel, so the majority of it. And what we're showing here is the percentage recovery of those domestic markets against 2019. And so you can see, tempting to sort of say geographically, but there's a real mixed bag here. Mexico and Colombia throughout the pandemic maintained growth, so that it's not a surprise to see them at the top of the table. We've got China's domestic market there, back to the sorts of growth rates it was at previously. Interesting to see Spain there, and a recent conversation with a client of ours in Spain alluded to the fact that there's a much more pragmatic, let's get back to the office culture, I think, in Spain, which is real contrast to other countries like the UK, for example, where there's been a move for office-based workers being in the office 2 days a week. So I suspect that that's partly driving why we're seeing strong recovery in Spain's domestic market, that business travel is back and people are back in the office. The USA has been pretty steady, hasn't it? We've seen
it has, but I think
discipline. Just get that out there.
Yeah, I think you've got to be careful here, Deirdre, because we're looking at the 2023 number here. If you look in the last couple of months in the US, that discipline has been broken, and everyone is adding capacity at quite significant rates, up to 17% from some of the ultra low cost carriers compared to this time last year. So that discipline has been broken, and it's going to be interesting to see how that will all play out. Edward, I wish I was an aviation consultant in Southeast Asia at the moment. I bet you cannot believe your luck to have Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia holding up the rest of the world. Says that there must be some work for you there.
It's certainly very interesting stats, and what we're seeing here in this part of the world, and maybe I'll just point your eyes up to Vietnam at the top as well. It's just disappeared off the chart, but Vietnam was a plus 8%, which is a bit of an outlier in Southeast Asia, is that Airlines have been struggling to bring their capacity back on stream as part of it. This was the domestic markets, which a lot of airlines as well are, I suppose, yield hunting right now. And the big thing we're seeing in Southeast Asia at the moment is a significant increase in flights destinations in India, as airlines see that as a very attractive market moving forwards, and that's very visible both in terms of O&D passengers into the region, but also connecting passengers through our part of the world. So I think some of the capacity that perhaps might have been put on domestic has gone into international. The other factor in this part of the world is the currencies have been somewhat weak against the US dollar. And so that is obviously impacting on the airline cost basis, as a lot of their costs are dollar based. And so they've been seeking to pass that through in terms of higher fares, which to a large extent they've succeeded in doing. The fares are noticeably higher here than they were pre-COVID. And so clearly that would have a dampening effect on travel as well. So I think there's a combination of price pressure on the one side and absence of capacity on the other, which is leading to this reduction. The flights, though, are generally jam-packed full. I fly quite a lot domestically in the region, and it's very rare to find an empty seat next to myself, sadly. But obviously, the airlines are generally making money there. The other thing I'd say is that a bit like the US, we're seeing the full-service carriers are actually doing better. The low-cost carriers are still struggling a bit, and AirAsia was just in the news yesterday talking about their need to charge higher fares. They were justifying that because there's some political pressure not to, and saying, look, we still lost money in the last quarter. We lost a lot of money last year. We do need to make that money back somehow. And so, yeah, they are struggling perhaps a little bit more than the full service carriers in the region right now.
Edward, one of the startling things, and we touched on it in our last webinar, is ancillary revenues. And some of the European carriers, well, they make more ancillary revenues than supermarkets do on a Saturday morning. I mean, it's phenomenal. And I know AirAsia and Tony Fernandez are past masters at this, but of the rest found ways to scrape dollars wherever they possibly can.
There's much more seat selling going on now, as in you pay a premium to sit in an extra legroom seat or a emergency exit seat or that sort of thing. That's become very, very common in the region. Selling stuff on board, much less common. Airlines are offering a lot more add-ons. You can buy extra baggage, you can buy lounge access, those sorts of things, which were not as common pre-COVID, I have to say. So yeah, they are making moves in that direction, but it's not Ryanair style. It's perhaps a little bit more restrained in the way that they do it, but it's clearly much more visible than it used to be.
Right.
Okay. Let's come back to the slide deck. Then thanks for that, Edward. I think just picking up on one point you made, I think we all got a bit used to that empty seat, didn't we? And it's a bit getting back to busy airports and busy aircraft. Is a good sign, but not quite so great.
Yeah, well, that being said, that's domestic. On international flights around the region, I often do find an empty seat next to me. It's rather different, and actually noticeably worse load factors in, I'd say, probably end of October. Up until now, it was actually at times quite dramatic. I was in flights with maybe 20 passengers in a 737-800, which was a bit shocking. I hadn't seen that for a while. It's going to be interesting because the year-end holiday season is coming up, and although a lot of countries here don't celebrate Christmas, but they do seem to have year-end school holidays. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that drives a big upswing in regional traffic at that point.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess we see the effect of that, don't we? To some extent, in there being still a lag in some of these international region pairs. This is obviously capacity, not packs, but interesting that we're not seeing the same effect.
I think the other thing easy to forget, of course, but the influence. I'm going back to this: the influence that governments are having on domestic air services, where they are able to exert more influence over transportation modes. So you can see France at -20. You haven't got Germany on there, Deirdre, but that's another quite significant minus market in terms of domestic. And I think we all get, that intermodal travel is the way forward if it works and it can be done and it's time efficient and effective. But at the same time, you still need connectivity from those regional markets to the hub airports for the onward flows that we see on the right-hand side. If you look at Northeast Asia, Western Europe, well, we're still at -39, and that circuitous routing all the way around Central Asia and back over the North Pole is clearly hampering that a little bit. It's very, very resource heavy for the airlines, and that's for them something they just can't afford to bear at the moment, and the market is still soft. But bizarrely, we begin to see some of the behaviours that we saw in 2019 and 2018, where airlines are putting on far too much capacity far too quickly. So I think 2 weeks ago we saw Hainan announce that they were going to start a daily Beijing-Manchester. I just don't see that there is a big enough market for a daily Manchester. Not at this moment in time. It was only 4 a week, I think, in 2019 before the pandemic.
Yeah.
What changed?
Actually, John, my son just moved to Manchester, and I was there in September, and Manchester is just full of East Asian people. I don't know what's happening, whether they're students or workers.
They certainly have a huge Chinese student community.
Yeah. So, and that was a bit of a surprise to me.
No, they certainly did have beforehand, and that was driving a lot of the market. And in someone else's geopolitical posturing, which we've seen between China and the United States and China and Australia, the three biggest overseas markets for Chinese students were the United Kingdom, China, and Australia, and two of them effectively were no-go areas for a period of time. So that gave more Chinese power to universities, and the northwest of England picked up on that very quickly.
See if the students are prepared to pay the effort.
Well, interesting.
Well, it explains why the first row of Old Trafford is always full of supporters from Asian markets.
Always finding a way to incorporate football into these webinars, John. I love it. I don't really. Anyway, let's turn back to the slide deck, and we're going to take a little bit of a look into some of the biggest airports in Southeast Asia. And it was interesting, Edward, we had a call last week to just prepare for today, and you made the point that in the last decade we saw really strong growth across some of the bigger airports in the region, and this kind of bears that out. We've just looked at capacity here and shown the picture in 2015, 2019, and now 2023. And the point of that is not so much to show how they're recovering, it's more to show the pace of growth that happened between that period. So I think what's really interesting is, all of this drives infrastructure need, and indeed we're seeing additional runway capacity being added across Jakarta, Singapore, and Bangkok. But that brings challenge, doesn't it? And as these markets begin to recover, those tensions in terms of constraints that were happening before are resurfacing, aren't they?
They are, yes. So when you look at the four largest ones, I mean, they all pushed through 60 million passengers and beyond in that decade from 2010 to 2019. So that put them firmly in the league of big sized airports. Manila probably would have got there if only they had slots. They are enormously slot constrained. It barely has a quiet hour in the whole 24 hours of a day, even at 2 and 3 a.m. It's a very, very busy airport because that is the only time when airlines can still find maybe a slot or two to operate. And so they're kind of stuck at that level until they can improve their slot capacity, which is partly an air traffic control issue, but also making some improvements to the airfield. Don Muang, interesting, and I think that reflects again what we're seeing, that low-cost airlines are still struggling a bit in this market relative to the full-service ones, because Don Muang was the Bangkok airport, which was ready for the low-cost airlines, whereas Suvarnabhumi, the BKK, is mainly for the primary ones. And actually, some low-cost flights have actually migrated back to Bangkok as well. So Don Muang is going to take a little bit of time to come back. And then Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, again, very, very hard to get slots, very, very busy airport, 2 close parallel runways. So they're doing pretty well with the traffic that they're handling at the moment. The Vietnam government is busy building or working on building another airport east of Ho Chi Minh City. That's not going to replace the existing one, but to supplement it. To give them more capacity. But the Ho Chi Minh City Hanoi route is one of the top 10 in the world, just very, very busy with sort of half-hourly flights, if not more frequent. What has happened though, just recently, last few weeks, is that my airline in Malaysia, which was a sort of low-cost, ultra-low-cost challenger airline, basically collapsed very abruptly. Sort of 5 a.m. the announcement went out that there'd be no flights that day, and obviously that caused a bit of distress amongst their passengers, who are in many cases already at the airport. And Bamboo Airlines in Vietnam has not collapsed, but they have basically withdrawn from international flying and consolidated themselves on domestic. They've given back about half their fleet. They had no problem giving it back. The lessors were delighted to receive aircraft back and be able to remarket them. But that's taken out some capacity from both Malaysia and Ho Chi Minh City, with those 2 airlines going through those difficulties. We're also seeing a bit of challenge now getting airline financing. Particularly in Malaysia, with miners going down, that means that people are just a bit twitchy. But I think across the region as well, people are going like, well, better be a bit careful. So airlines are kind of like, they're seeing the market they want to expand into, but they're struggling to perhaps get the funding together to be able to add on that extra capacity. That's beside the shortage of aircraft and everything else.
I always wondered about Bamboo in terms of a strategy that had 787s operating as far as London. Looking for connecting traffic into Southeast Asia and indeed down to Australia with a brand name that is unknown. Normally only ends in tears. But your point about lessors taking aircraft back, I mean, we are in a very different position to where we were in the middle of the pandemic. Lessors want those aircraft back. They are able to charge top dollar to place those back out again at this moment in time. We heard last week that one airline is paying over $400,000 a month for some 320s on dry leases to backfill some of their capacity that they just can't operate because of the supply chain shortages. So it's really, it's really interesting how the table has turned, and suddenly lessors can't get their fleets back quick enough to replace and reallocate.
And there's a sort of perfect storm, isn't there, in terms of the maintenance piece, the supply chain impact of airlines putting aircraft in for maintenance on a sort of a 4 to 6 month schedule, and then finding at the last minute that actually there's a spare part that hasn't been sourced or can't be sourced. And that aircraft might be out for a further 6 months. That's a really difficult environment to plan in, isn't it? And you can sort of see that actually it plays well for the lessors, doesn't it? Who I guess are working hard to be the providers of that sort of interim capacity.
And we heard there is one very large airline that publicly said they currently have 40 aircraft grounded at this moment in time because of supply chain issues. Now that's more aircraft than a mid-sized airline would have in Europe, completely grounded, no idea when they're going to get the spares. And actually, the longer it goes on, you're going to have to do more maintenance just to keep those existing aircraft operational and airworthy when they can actually get the spares. So it is a perfect storm, and it's not going to go away in 2024 or probably 2025 from what people are saying.
Yeah, so we're seeing airlines just scraping and scrambling to get anything they can. So, I mean, Malaysia Airlines just took delivery of an ex-Scandinavian A350. Different seating config, but they were just happy to get the capacity. And I think also happily, they've just received their first two 738s, which were quite significantly delayed out of the factory. So they've just come in the past 2 weeks. So we're starting to see a little bit of flow of aircraft inbound, but it's tough. And the other issue as well is that MRO has become very, very hard to get hold of. So just lack of capacity in hangars. So even if you can get the spare parts, Deirdre, you can't find a slot to get the aircraft into the hangar to fit them.
And you know, we also heard last week at this event that John and I were at, that actually resources in terms of experienced engineers is another factor. And you know, all of the issues that arose where lots of aircraft were on the ground during COVID and could be worked on during the day. And so you've got people who've come in to do MRO roles on a sort of day working basis. And now, of course, the fleet's in the air during the day. And, you know, there's a shift to night shift working. And that sounds like a really simple, straightforward thing, but it's another factor that's having an impact in terms of, you know, people's willingness or otherwise to work at different times of the day or night. And how attractive as an industry this is. You know, it's that shift, isn't it, in terms of sort of generational expectations. So all of those things are playing out and having a factor. And I'm not sure that, you know, when we were sitting a year ago or even 2 years ago, thinking about how the industry was going to come back out of the pandemic, we sort of looked at resources from we had a challenge, didn't we, around airlines and airports not having enough resources themselves in terms of processing passengers because of COVID, because of a shift to other industries. Now we're seeing this wider ecosystem impact, aren't we? That is like the long tail of challenge for airlines to recover. And I think there's no quick resolution to that, is there?
And we've not touched on issues such as, you know, air traffic control resources, availability of experienced, qualified staff in Europe, in North America, and now in Southeast Asia. That's beginning to be the case. We've not talked about infrastructure issues, US FAA, you know, recognition that they need to do a lot of work on their operating systems and processes. Yeah, there's lots of hard work and yards to be done to get things where they need to be. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And, you know, these are not things you're going to solve overnight.
No, in fact, if anything, I'm seeing this as a developing problem. We've just started work with a major airline-owned MRO in the region. And it was very noticeable that the average age of the staff in the hangars was beyond middle age. Very few young people around. So you know, the youngsters are not coming in, and they're seeing a huge demographic problem. A lot of people are going to be retiring, and they don't have the people to replace them. So this is going to be a long run problem. It's not just something here.
And this is not something really that AI can fix, is it?
No, and you've got the skill sets for an avionics engineer are pretty similar to those that someone who wants to get into computer science, for example, you know, and therefore people are probably making choices that are related to lifestyle, Deirdre, as much as anything else, and their skill set that they might earn more, you know, working in computers and AI and other areas than at 3 o'clock in the morning in a hangar where it's just finished raining and it's a bit damp and horrible outside.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. If nothing else, lots to talk about in our webinar program in 2024, but it feels a bit gloomy, doesn't it? Talking of gloomy, let's move on to our next slide. which is a tale of two halves, I think, really, isn't it? If that's the right analogy, maybe not. We wanted to just take a look at this. So credit to Airline Weekly, who produced this piece of analysis a couple of weeks ago, looking at quarter 3 earnings as of mid-November. And there's real extremes, aren't there? You know, it will not be a surprise to see Ryanair at the top of this table. Strong performance in terms of earnings this quarter. They're going to pay a dividend for the first time ever. And they also are planning to get to be debt-free within the next 2 years. Now, there's an aspiration, isn't there, for carriers all over. They're setting the bar high, aren't they, John?
Yeah, they've had a phenomenal run through the recovery process ahead of everyone else. 20+% more capacity than pre-pandemic. Literally left everyone behind in Europe in terms of their recovery, their cost efficiencies, fleet orders, their ability to drive ancillary revenues. I mean, it's no wonder that they've produced the results they have. But then they're surrounded by other low-cost carriers. It's been a good year for the low-cost carriers. It will be interesting to see if that is such the case in 2024, as we see demand perhaps softening a little bit in some markets. I think it's just as interesting at the other end of that spectrum and that table, Deirdre, the ones who have not performed very well during a period when most of the industry was reported record revenues and profitability. There are some warning signs there, and many of those are actually based in the US. Part of the difference there and the results is that they tend not to hedge their fuel price. Mm-hmm. And there's been some pretty hefty spikes in the price of oil, but there always are at this time of year, so you can't be surprised by those really. And in the last couple of weeks, it has softened back again. But if you can't make money now, when are you going to make money?
Can you?
Yeah, and that's why I think we are at that tipping point in some regional markets around the world. Not in any of those we're talking about specifically in Southeast Asia, who I think have got more upside than downside. But I think it's going to be tougher. And maybe this is when the legacy carriers with their networks and the ability to flow traffic from one part of the world to another may actually begin to benefit again compared to their low-cost peers.
From that, yeah. There's also there's a sort of burning question, isn't there, about throughout this crisis, we've seen a lag, haven't we, and different pace of recovery in different parts of the world. And some of that's driven by the US obviously having a big domestic market, which was able to restart and well, it didn't ever properly stop, did it? But and China, I guess, to some extent too. Is your sense that this cycle of a market getting to recovery, there being a bit of capacity discipline, and then we're starting to see a few alarm bells? Is this something you think is going to ripple out to other regions in the world? I mean, $64,000 question, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know. Will Luton ever win another game in the Premier League? We don't know the answer to it.
Again, with the football references.
I think because of the issues that we're now facing, the supply chain issues, the resources, etc., it is not going to be as pronounced in other parts of the world. What we've seen in North America is the virtual abandonment of the regional aircraft types and the move to larger aircraft, which is part of this whole process. That is not going to happen in other parts of the world, and particularly not in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, because there was very little regional jet flying per se. We've always remarked that the smallest pieces of equipment tend to be 73s and A320s, and that will still be the case. So I don't think we're going to see that structural shift in capacity and operating type. And I think that's a key differential that we will see. So we probably won't see the same behavior and the same patterns that we have seen in the US. And we got some data later, I think, about how we're beginning to see fares and yields soften in some markets. So I think it's a characteristic that is just going to occur in Americas and perhaps a little bit in Europe.
Okay.
But there are other.
John, I think what you said just now is, I think, quite interesting about the full service carriers having the ability to flex passengers between routes, whereas LCCs are very much point to point. And the other couple of observations along those lines are that a lot of the full service carriers have been forced to take out significant cost during COVID and have learned how to maybe operate at a lower cost base level. And at the same time, the cost of fuel and aircraft has gone up. So that would have squeezed the difference between the LCCs and the full services. I think the passenger, if they have a choice and it's going to be a similar fare, they're probably going to pick full service over an LCC. I guess my last comment on the page that you just had up is that I think Hawaiian have just agreed to be bought by Alaskan. And Hawaiian was one of the red loss-making ones. So I guess they finally succumbed and decided to merge with someone a bit bigger.
But I think the other thing, Deirdre, that the elephant in the room that everyone, certainly in the Middle East, doesn't really want to talk about, or at least discuss in a rational, pragmatic way, is the impact of Saudi Arabia and Vision 2030 on the whole market. Yesterday, FlyNAS launched a 3 times weekly service from Brussels to Jeddah. There isn't demand for a 3 times weekly service from Brussels to Jeddah. Sorry, Leon in Brussels, you yourself. It's being paid for by the air connectivity program in Saudi Arabia that is trying to stimulate demand. And it's a very righteous type sort of thing, and absolutely right to try and diversify the economy off of oil into other sectors, into fintech and into tourism. But it's not going to go from 110 million to 330 million by the end of this decade. And let's not forget, Saudi Arabian domestic capacity this year is 11% down on where it was last year. So, we're going to see a flood of capacity. So Tim Clark is not going to say, please eat my passengers and take my revenue away from me. Help yourself to everyone and let them flow through Riyadh or Jeddah. So I think that's going to be a big destabilizing factor in the next decade.
I think the whole competitive dynamic in the Middle East is going to be one to watch, isn't it? And just in terms of, we obviously have had the new terminal at Abu Dhabi open, which was built for 40 million. We went into there last week. It was lovely, but it was very quiet. I think, and then we had a massive order, didn't we, from Fly Dubai at the Dubai Air Show. So I think there's how that is all going to play out. And you're right, John. It's not just a Middle East phenomenon. It will play into emergent markets, both east and west, because the need to drive volume growth means that Saudi will have to pursue volume-based markets. So yeah, let's. I'm sure we will be talking about this subject on and on in the years to come. Okay, let's come back to the slide deck. My Hawaiian Alaskan slide is right at the end, so but maybe we might get the chance to come to that if we have time. We borrowed this from this afternoon's slide deck, where we've got Eddie Pianzek from Ishka joining us. But we thought this was interesting, obviously, and we've talked a little bit about the headwinds for airlines. This is good news, I guess, in that we're seeing oil prices coming back down again, particularly in the context of those US carriers, John, who typically aren't hedging. And I guess, Edward, you referenced the strength of the dollar and the impact that's having on
on Southeast Asia.
all over the place. Yeah. So let's go on to the next one. So we talked about My Airline, who I think are not on this list. Ishka, again, I think this was a pandemic.
Yeah, we've seen this at the beginning of the pandemic
for them.
Yeah.
And this is their sort of assessment, their matrix that looks at the vulnerability of carriers. As is evident, red is not a good place to be. Green is a strong place to be. And I'm not sure there are any surprises really here on this matrix, are there?
Lucky Air are clearly very unlucky. We can conclude that. Their brand name isn't reflected in an assessment of their performance. No, there's no great surprise, and that comes back to this whole thing about what's going to happen in the Middle East when two of the most heavily backed and ranked airlines in the world are sitting there, Qatar Airways and Emirates. And there are some interesting moves. I mean, I think one example is Jet2 in the UK, and we probably, as an industry, don't give them enough credit for both their operation, how they've weathered the pandemic. They were one of the few carriers who completely stopped operation at one stage in a pandemic and actually said we will not fly until July, I think it was, 2020. And that seems to have worked very well for them. It's where you'd expect most of these to be, I think, Deirdre. Some are destined to always seem to survive. Royal Jordanian, extremely high risk, even more so at the moment because of events taking place right now. But backed all the way by the government, and with new aircraft orders, and yet another new strategy being rolled out in the next couple of years, which looks remarkably like the same strategy that was rolled out a few years earlier. But maybe it is different in some way or other.
I think interesting though, isn't it, that we saw on the slide earlier in the Q3 results that many, with the exception of the US, many low-cost carriers performing well on that front. So it's kind of interesting to see, and Edward, I'm sure you'll have a view on this. Southeast Asia's biggest low-cost carrier actually squarely in the red here, by contrast to its global peers, Ryanair, Wizz, who different markets, so it's hard, isn't it, to draw a full comparison. But yeah, I think interesting to see that.
Yeah, no, that's going to be the struggle to come back into the market. Although I would say, I think for some of these Southeast Asian ones, the issue is perhaps a little bit negative around the government support. AirAsia doesn't have formal government support, but clearly the government is very interested in making sure that they don't fail. So, and similarly, Vietnam Airlines, I think I'd probably watch it over to be more where Royal Jordanian is. I'm seeing quite a lot of evidence that they get in sort of background support, even if it's not foreground support. Yeah, so it's hard to see, but you kind of know it's there.
We'll put that to them this afternoon. So anyone interested in that conversation, you can dial back in later and see how the land lies. Okay, let's move on then. We mentioned that we had some fare data to share with you, and I think apologies that the source data here is Infare. And we'll add that. I think it's on my afternoon slide deck, but not on this one. But that will give a little bit of just clarity on the information. But this is covering December, January, and February, and it's looking at fare data 4 months out, I think, from departure. So what we're showing here is for the top 20 routes in capacity terms, international routes, what the average fares were in winter 22-23 versus current winter 23-24. And we're seeing across Southeast Asia, certainly, almost 3/4 of these routes seeing fares fall this winter. And there are some sort of significant reductions, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, Singapore, down by approaching a third on last winter. I think, there's never a sort of good moment in time to do snapshot comparisons, are there? Because there always will be underlying factors. We could have looked at 1920 versus this winter. When we're comparing back to last winter, particularly in Southeast Asia, the market was not fully open, was it? And you had sort of significant elevations in fares, didn't you? Because people who needed to travel really needed to travel.
This is, if we're comparing it to this time last year, that sort of blockage of revenge spend and frustrated demand was still there in Asia and was being released, and more routes were open, more capacity was coming online, and people were out there and had disposable income, and we're beginning to return, perhaps, I think, to more normalised fares. To Edward's point that he mentioned earlier, if you're getting on a 737 and there's only 20 of you on an international route, then airlines are going to be trying desperately hard to stimulate demand, and the only thing at their disposal, quite frankly, is reducing fares, which we're seeing happen. And we have got the data for 2019, and we know these are still ahead of 2019 levels, but we are returning to a more normalised pattern. So do you hold out? Do you buy now? Whenever you buy a ticket, you always feel you should have waited an extra day, or you miss the seat sale that suddenly comes along.
Yeah, so a couple of additional observations here. I think one is that there's been some currency softening. Certainly Malaysia is down against the US dollar by about 6.8% over the past year. So that might explain a little bit of this softening, given that these numbers are in US dollars. The other countries in the region, say like Indonesia, actually there's not been much move at all over the past year. Well, it's gone up and down, but it's now about the same as it was a year ago. So perhaps that's less applicable to some of those other Southeast Asian markets. What we're also seeing is that airlines are still maybe holding their headline fares, and we're seeing some eye-wateringly high fares at peak times, but they're becoming very active at offering specials and discounts. Often have a campaign period. This week we'll give you discount fares, and then you go in and you find that you can pick up something quite reasonable if you go in during that period, and then they'll stop it again, and then a couple of weeks later it'll start again. So they seem to be kind of using that as a way to maintain their headline high numbers, but to actually get some capacity sold when they're seeing a bit of softening in demand. So much more dynamic maybe than it used to be. And I think the Hong Kong, Singapore, China basically wasn't open a year ago, and I think there's a bit of an impact there. What we've also seen, and this is very, very recent, is countries are starting to say, like, again, Malaysia has just announced that China and India visitors can have 30 days entry with no visa. And obviously needing to go and get a visa is a big off-putting factor when people are planning their travel. So I think we may see a bit more demand being stimulated as a result of actions like that. And quite a few countries across the region are now being much more relaxed about visas than they used to be to try and get those tourists coming in.
You're absolutely right. I mean, when we went through the Middle East, the UAE had just in recent weeks opened their e-gates, and it was a really easy process for anyone to get through, I think. But the other thing about this fares data is, you have to be looking at this all the time, because we will forget. And to your point, Edward, there was very few flights permitted between China and the US this time last year, and economy one-way or economy round-trip fare, I think, was something ridiculous like $10,000 or $8,000, because capacity was so restricted, and the requirements to travel were so exhaustive. The airlines felt they could charge what they wanted to, quite frankly.
And I think
that's all buried in the data. That will still be there for the next 5 years. We'll be making those references.
I think we see that evidently, John, just exactly that point. If we look at the same data, but for the Southwest Pacific market,
yeah,
and you can see Haneda, Sydney, average fares there, and these are economy fares, were $1,600 this time last year. Which just was reflective of that market not being, not being fully open. So. I guess the interesting thing will be to come back to this 6 months from now or 12 months from now and see really whether have we sort of reached a new baseline in terms of fares at their current levels, or will we see that change?
If we keep referring back to have fares normalised, what do we mean by normalised?
Yeah, what is normal?
Yeah, and more importantly, if they normalise back to what was 2019, most airlines' cost have increased by probably 30% since then. So, that's a worry in itself. If we normalise back to 2019, we have to accept that air travel generally is going to be a more expensive product than it was. Inflation, all of those things have had their toll.
And that's the reality, isn't it? However, let me just, I'm conscious of time, so let me just put up my second last slide. We might get to that Hawaiian one. We might not. If we don't, we'll be talking about it this afternoon. We've talked a lot about airlines' ability to manage the fleet that they have. We've got some big aircraft orders out there. We heard from Indigo's CEO last week that they have got a new aircraft coming into the fleet every week for the next decade. That is significant volume being added. Now, the flip side to that is you've got an emergent middle class in India, haven't you, who've increasingly got disposable income to spend on travel. So you've got people traveling who haven't previously before. But if you look at the size of the fleet that's on order, accepting that some of this is replacement, but a lot of this is growth.
It's a lot of work from airlines who probably don't have the resources to do this at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's not just about accepting delivery of a new aircraft. You can get into a process for doing that. But if you are returning aircraft back to lessors, you've got to do all of your return checks before you can actually return it to them. Sometimes you have to match the engines back to the right frame and all of these sort of bits and pieces that are not quite as easy as it seems. This is going to be a big challenge for all of these airlines who've got such large aircraft orders. It's great for the environment. These are much more sustainable, better ranges, all of the things that we talk about that open up new markets. But it's a lot of work where the resources are just not there at the moment.
I think what's also interesting is that the reality is that much of this flying is going to come on narrow-body aircraft, isn't it? And we're seeing increasingly longer journeys on 737 Maxes and A321s. It feels like journey times of 7 hours, maybe longer, may become the norm. And there will be a market, whilst we were speculating the other day, John, weren't we, on, is that something we want to, we want to throw ourselves into?
Well, we've seen a lot of that here. Batik here in Kuala Lumpur is flying to Auckland with a 737 via Perth.
If you have no passengers on it, though, Edward, anything is possible.
No, they're flying via Perth. So
it's
a very, very long journey by the time you stopped in Perth on the way, which isn't quite a direct route. They're also flying to Tokyo and Melbourne and Sydney. Melbourne and Sydney stopover in Denpasar on the way. So they're doing a lot of interesting things with these 738s that they've recently added to the fleet.
And if you don't operate with 5 times weekly frequency, then you don't get crew efficiency, do you? And your costs just escalate because you're paying for your staff to be in a reasonable hotel somewhere in Australia or New Zealand. So it's a bit of a gung-ho strategy. You're adding a lot of capacity against legacy brands. So you've got to price really cheaply to get your share of that market.
Yeah.
Yes, and I haven't looked very seriously at their pricing, but
I wonder why.
I haven't quite had the ambition to fly so far.
Maybe you could look into that, test it out, and come back and tell us how the experience was. I'll look forward to that.
They do have better legroom than the other regional airlines in the region. But my last point I just want to make was that India has just now hit 5th largest economy in the world, and it's not going to be long before it becomes the 3rd largest, because it's only a little bit behind Germany and Japan. So perhaps not surprising that we're seeing all that growth in Indian domestic, but also between India and nearby countries. So it's going to be something to watch.
Interestingly, Air India's announcement or messaging last week that they don't wish to see any more international capacity increases into India from foreign airlines. Because they quite rightfully want to grow their own market and their own business and stop leakage. That's another one of these geopolitical sort of bilateral things that's going to rumble on for some time. The Middle East carriers would love more Indian capacity.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I'm afraid we are approaching time. We're a little bit past time. I think we'll have to get to our Hawaiian Alaskan discussion this afternoon. So apologies, Edward, unless you fancy joining us again in the middle of the night to come back for that. I'm sure you'll be able to pass.
I did raise it for you, so
yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks for your fascinating insights in what's actually happening in the region. And thanks also to you, John. We will be back, as I've said a couple of times. We'll be back later this afternoon to take more of a look at Europe and North America, but to talk through some of the issues we've talked about. And it strikes me that certainly one of the topics on our upcoming webinar program has to be India again. I think it's been a year since we looked at India in depth. So watch this space for some New Year content on that front. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us. You will get a copy of the recording and the slides later on today. And have a good day, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.